It looked like they were like joined together at one.
When you look at a globe of the Earth, it is easy to think that our planet has always looked this way, that the continents and ocean basins are where they've always been and where they will always be. But if you examine the globe more closely, you may notice something curious. Some of the continents appear as if they may have been joined at one time. A good example of this are the coastlines of South America and Africa. When you compare them, you will find, with just a little bit of adjustment, that they match quite nicely, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And see how the island of Madagascar slides next to Africa. The same goes for North America. Its eastern coastline fits nicely around portions of Africa.
Recent common matrilineal female ancestor who lived about 150,000 years ago in Africa. But the same can be done for markers on the Y chromosome, which are only passed from father to son. Our most recent common male ancestor also lived in Africa, but much later, around 60,000 years ago. This video will look at what happened next, and how we know that these ancestors migrated out of Africa and the routes they took to colonize the world. Wells found distinctive genetic markers and traced each back to its source, marked here by red circles. We're retracing the migration paths our ancestors took backwards through time, and this is where they started, once again in Africa.
The questions to you, like I got you. Now, check this out. If the white man at one time was African,
yes,
do you see him as our brother? Is he African today?
Yes, he is. Oh, but he's beyond this. You know, he's beyond our African. There's only one race on the planet.
That's the black race.
The human race.
The human race.
And because of biological climatology, this race was born in a warm, temperate climate. If geographically speaking, the warmest part of the planet had been China, black folk would be from China. Geographically speaking, we are children of the sun. It makes no difference where you are geographically.
American scholars would soon follow. As they studied and translated Egyptian documents and unearthed monuments, Black Africa, it was clear, was the mother of Western civilization.
By the almost unanimous testimony of the ancient historians, the Egyptians belonged to an African race which first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile.
Human civilization started in Africa. There was an article in the July 29th, 2001 issue of U.S. News and World Report. In this issue, they stated that through DNA analysis, that scientifically it has been proven that civilization started in Africa.
During the 1700s, famous French historian Count Constantin de Volney viewed the Sphinx during a trip to Egypt. This was before its nose and lips were allegedly disfigured by the cannons of French soldiers during their invasion of Egypt. When de Volney saw this awesome structure, he later wrote,
On seeing that head, typically Negro in all its features, the ancient Egyptians were true Negroes of the same type as all native-born Africans.
Here's an eyewitness depiction of the Sphinx, sketched by Baron V. Denon prior to the disfigurement, regarded by some to be the handiwork of French soldiers. Other Egyptian statues were disfigured in precisely the same way. One can only speculate about the motives of such vandalism. The image of the black man had been distorted.
And then John Hawkins came into Africa. He lived among our people for 20 to 25 years, studying our ways, studying our mannerisms and the way in which we operated. And he had a plan in his mind. The black people, when John Hawkins and other Europeans came to Africa, the black people saw these strange looking people coming. But when we saw you coming, being a strange looking man, a pale man, we didn't turn around and say, oh, look at that pale man, let's kill him. Look at that pale man, let's discriminate against him. No, we open our arms to you. We said, welcome, stranger.
That's right.
You may look different, but you got two legs, you got two arms, you got a mouth and eyes and ears like us, so you must be another human being. You must be a member of the human family. And so we welcomed you in to our places of abode, into our villages and hamlets, and into our towns and cities. And you went to work, watching, observing, looking at the way in which we live, until you felt that you had sufficient information to make your move. And then John Hawkins and those with him made their move. The move is called, in the popular language, divide and rule. Right. Divide and conquer. Go ahead.
Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick, and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land. Not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the West. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly.
I've seen alligators on jars, I've seen alligator ashtrays, and I've seen them depicted with kids in it. And I was wondering why the children would be there. As a matter of fact, this particular pencil sharpener, this is a pencil sharpener or a pencil holder with a kid, a black head of a baby sitting out of its mouth. I didn't pay any attention. I have a been collecting for quite a few years, and I have the posters and things like that about different things. And then one day I was down in Florida. I'd gone down with my wife, and I took a trip for myself off to the wild blue yonder, going out to hunt artifacts. And in my quest to hunt artifacts, I came upon a pawn shop in Sanford, Florida. In the pawn shop was a gentleman who owned it. They went and got him and told him I was there and I wanted to buy some of the shackles he had hanging around the walls. I asked him, could I buy them? He said no. He didn't want to sell anything. He just wanted me to see it. He said, you know, he said, you probably don't know this. He said, but years ago, he said, my grandfather, before he died, told me of the things they would do. He said he would go down. He said his grandfather said they would go down and they would take babies with them. I said, what do you mean babies? He says, well, let me tell you. He said the slaves with them. I said, what do you mean babies? He says, well, let me tell you. He said the slave babies, the slaves who had babies, they would steal the babies during the course of the day, sometimes when the mothers weren't washing. I said, what do you mean babies? I said, you mean babies like 5 or 6 years old? He says, no. These babies, some would be infants, some would be a year old. He said some would be toddlers. He said they would grab these children and take them down to the swamp and leave them in pens like little chicken coops. They would go down there at night, take these babies and tie them up because they hunted the big bull alligators. These big bull alligators were not raised on farms. They were in the wild. These alligators would weigh 600, 700, 800 pounds. Those are the ones they wanted. They would skin them, make the wallets, get the meat, do different things with them. He said, but what they were doing was tie them up, put a rope around their neck and around their torso, around here, and tie it tight. He said the baby, I said, well, what would the babies be doing? He said, well, my grandfather said they'd be screaming. He said, what would you do? He said, just let them scream. He said, what they would do, he would help them to chum the water. He said, when they would throw the babies in, tied to this rope, he said, in a matter of minutes, he said, the alligators were on them. He said the alligators would clamp his jaws on that child. As a matter of fact, once he clamped on him, he was really swallowed. You couldn't see anything but the rope. And we would pull the alligator in and tie his nose and hit him in the head with an axe, a pickaxe. He said we would then drag him to the shore. We'd drag him to the shore and leave him lay, and we would do it again, maybe 2 or 3 times a night. I said, so what do you mean? He said, well, yeah, they were taking these babies and killing them for alligator bait. I said, so all these things I've been collecting, all these things I've been collecting are really, really something that I can really talk about and say they are the truth. By what you say, he said, I'm telling you, he said, nobody wants to talk about it. He said, I'm only telling you because you're here. I may never hear from you again. He said, but these things actually depict the acts that they did to slave babies back in the Bayou country and down the south. They did this. They hunted alligators with these babies. That's why they call alligator bait.
Once the women became impregnated en masse, the slave master then took it to another level. When the women were pregnant, sometimes 7 and 8 months pregnant, or just before the time for the birth of the babies,
teach on it, brother, go on.
They would bring the black women out into a courtyard.
Listen up.
They would select between 1 and 10 women out of hundreds who were pregnant. And the slave trader, the slave maker, the slave master would tie the woman to a tree. There were many, many different devices that they used. This is one of them. He would then get a large knife or a small sword, and he would cut the woman from the sternum bone in the chest right down to the bone just above the top of the vagina, causing the stomach to be completely open and the unborn child to fall out of the womb of the woman onto the ground.
Listen.
The woman would then witness the slave maker take his boot and stamp the head of the baby into the dust,
Go ahead.
forcing all the other women who were pregnant to observe this, to watch this. Those women would be in such fear and terror. The vision from their eye would be transmuted in the brain, and the brain would send a message of pure adrenaline fear into the rest of the unborn children already in the wombs of their mothers. they were doing a scientific making of a slave. Our children were to be born with fear already inbuilt in them. Fear of the Caucasian. Fear of the white man, the slave master. Fear that was being engendered in the very unborn fetus.
The Southern legal system became an instrument of intimidation. Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida passed laws that virtually prohibited freedmen from any work except as field hands. The laws were called Black Codes. The aim was slavery without the chain.
The Black Codes were laws passed to control and restrict and constrain the lives of the freed people, essentially rendering them bondsmen again under law.
Some states made it illegal for freedmen to handle weapons and restricted them from buying or renting land. Black children could be seized from poor families and forced to work in the fields. If a black man had no job, he could be jailed and auctioned to a planter for his labor.
They make a travesty of the freedom that African Americans have acquired.
Once Reconstruction ended, the people who were in charge of the South before the Civil War slowly started to regain power. And these people were not happy that their slaves were now freedmen. And so they began to pass a number of laws known as the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was the name of a popular minstrel show. And a minstrel show was a performance that made fun of black people. And on your screen right now, you're seeing an example of a minstrel show from the 1940s. The Jim Crow laws were designed to isolate African Americans and place them in an inferior position compared to white people. This was the beginning of segregation in the post-Civil War South. In many Southern churches, people were taught that whites were the chosen people and that blacks were cursed. Here's some examples of Jim Crow laws. A black male and a white male could not shake hands because it implied that both were socially equal. Blacks and whites were not supposed to eat together. Now, if they did eat together, whites were to be served first, and some sort of partition was to be placed between them. And under no circumstances was a black male to offer to light a cigarette of a white female. Whites did not use courtesy titles of respect when referring to blacks. For example, Mr., Mrs., Miss, Sir, or Ma'am. Instead, black people were called by their first name or some sort of derogatory term. White motorists had the right of way at all intersections. And lastly, if a black person rode in a car driven by a white person, the black person had to sit in the back seat or the back of a truck. Although it is perfectly clear that this is a violation of civil rights, the Supreme Court ruled the Jim Crow laws were constitutional in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896.
Ask yourself the question, if you grow up and growing up you see literally thousands of examples in cartoons, in movies, in books, and in real life of blacks being the victims of pain, the victims of aggression, and also the perpetuators, what seeds does that plant? What we try to do in the entire museum is to re-emphasize that the pieces in here are caricatures. They are not real people. It's a distortion, it's a lie.